So if we are having a retreat of all the glaciers and have more land-terminating glacier-influenced fjords as opposed to submarine glacier-influenced fjords, that might dramatically, or at least a little bit, affect the ecosystem composition.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. My name is Alice Stuart-Lee, and I'm a marine scientist at the Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research. So I'm in the final year of my PhD, and my project is mostly looking at the drivers of seasonal change in fjord systems in Greenland.
Thank you, and it's great to have you here. And today we're going to talk about your paper about Ameralik Fjord. Do I pronounce that correctly?
Probably not the best person to ask. I think it's Ameralik, but you hear a lot of different pronunciations.
Okay, but it is a fjord near Nuuk in Greenland, and the big thing about this fjord and why you investigate it is because it's not subject to marine terminating glaciers, but it receives its freshwater supply from land.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. But there were a lot of fjords to choose from with land terminating glaciers, but the other big thing about Ameralik is that it's very accessible, being right next to Nuuk, and it's also right next to Fjord, this much better studied fjord just to the north. That it shares the climatic region and it shares a melt region, so it just offers a really nice comparison.
Because Fjord has the marine terminating glacier and Ameralik doesn't.
Exactly, and there are lots of other differences. They're quite different in their geometry and so on, but we have so much information from really long-term detailed monitoring projects in Fjord that it just offers so much for being able to understand Ameralik a bit better.
That's great. And you have a quite impressive data set from Ameralik, don't you? Like several CTD transects from different seasons?
Yeah, we did a lot of seasonal studying in 2019. It's the basis of my PhD project. So we're doing physical studies, but also biogeochemical and some biological sampling as well. But we wanted to start with the CTD data because, of course, it forms a sort of groundwork for these other projects.
Yeah, the backbone of physical oceanography, isn't it?
So we started with that, but actually we ended up incorporating some data that wasn't mine from the Weather Institute at Nuuk, and also some longer term monitoring that Lawrence had done. So we also had some monthly CTD casts for the whole of 2019, which was really invaluable.
That's great. And from the ship, you sampled a long fjord transect. So you drove into the fjord and you sampled stations from the mouth of the fjord to the, how do you call that, the end of the fjord? The cul-de-sac?
The inner fjord.
The inner fjord.
I'm not sure what the technical term is. It also varied a little bit according to how much ice was there. So in September we got a lot further into the fjord than in the spring. At least in Fjord, it's not such an issue in Ameralik.
Okay. And sampling the seasonal cycle, could you summarize how does a season look like in the fjord in terms of stratification and water exchange? Like, what is the typical seasonal cycle in Ameralik Fjord?
Okay, I think the pattern we generally see, and of course I can't really extrapolate based just on 1 year of data, but there is a lot of long-term monitoring going on that hasn't been published, and we just generally see the same patterns. It's generally pretty well mixed. There's almost no stratification in the wintertime. We describe dense coastal inflows in this paper, and that's working to replace some of the fjord water with coastal water, and it gets displaced, and there's mixing going on. So we have a pretty homogeneous fjord. Then of course we have the start of the meltwater season. So we start to get quite a bit more fresh water coming in the inner fjord. And then we have much more stratification because it's only enters at the surface. So it's buoyant and it's just sits there. We get a variety of different circulation patterns. The estuarine circulation is much stronger in the summertime as the meltwater increases. We have this intermediary circulation. And I guess it sort of goes in the opposite direction then as freshwater starts to retreat from autumn onwards. Then we start to get the density increasing again and mixing processes.
And the density increase then would come from, in exchange with the more dense shelf water, with the fjord waters so that shelf water comes in, which is denser. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, so in the winter time, the increase in density primarily comes from these dense inflows. Yeah.
Do you have any idea? That's speculation. And
we also have the freshwater export over time, which increases the density. Yeah.
Yeah, like this classical estuarine exchange that you're having when you have a lateral density gradient, right?
Yeah, but there's some other mixing going on in the mouth that involves some exchange with the coastal water.
Mm-hmm. And just as a speculation, do you have any idea if the exchange in winter with the shelf water, if that happens like steadily, like a little bit at all times, or is it like more event driven that certain circulation patterns drive a like episodic exchange where you have a lot of exchange over a short time period and then nothing so much over the other times?
My impression is that it's more the latter. There have been studies on this that sort of monitor these events through the changes in density and see little peaks. Mm-hmm. So them occurring in individual events. True.
And I guess these inflows are quite of importance for the ecosystem and the biology. I mean, they renew waters, they bring in new nutrients, new oxygen, new...
Well, the incoming coastal water, certainly it also affects zooplankton and life. So the composition of the coastal water, depending on whether you're getting Atlantic water or polar water, it has different zooplankton species. So that's pretty key for the fjord ecology.
Okay, so you have this annual cycle investigated in Ameralik, and then you compared that with the hydrography and the seasonal hydrography in Fjord. And what are the main differences you found there?
Well, we already mentioned the sill depth earlier, so that's certainly one big factor. That
how deep are they in the different fjords? Do you know?
Ameralik is about 100 meters, and Fjord is about 200 meters. You get different estimates in different places, but it's about double the depth in Fjord.
That seems to be pretty relevant because I guess that blocks the exchange and shelters, like a shallower sill shelters from incoming deep water masses because they just can't flow over the sill, right?
That's exactly it. Of course, the coastal water is made up of different layers, and the upper layer is relatively shallow. So the deeper the sill, the greater the ratio of one to the other. So although they share the same mouth region, they could have quite a different composition of coastal water. I mean, you could also have slightly different routes of coastal water into the fjords, but I think the sill depth is one huge factor in that composition that comes in. And we see in this study that also makes a big difference to the water properties in the fjords. The basin water of Ameralik is a lot colder.
And coming back to the difference between marine terminating, land terminating, glacier influenced fjords, what's the big difference you found there? Because I think you said that land terminating glaciers are the future of Greenland because the more and more the glaciers retreat, the more and more fjords won't have marine terminating glaciers at the inner fjord anymore, but land terminating glaciers?
Eventually, yes. So of course, sorry, I got distracted away from the question, but the big difference, apart from geometry and bathymetry, is in the glacial structures. There are 3 huge marine terminating glaciers in the inner fjord of Fjord. It has a much more complex structure and a very different freshwater input. So we have a completely different picture to that of Ameralik.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that? What does the different freshwater input do to the stratification in summer in the fjords?
Well, one factor is that the amount of glacial meltwater entering Fjord is so much greater. It has more glaciers and more icebergs, more meltwater, that it's not actually more stratified as a result of that freshwater. And one of the factors is the subglacial discharge that's coming out of these glaciers is rising and entraining a lot of water, and it's a huge source of mixing in the inner fjord. So that works against a lot of the stratification that we might see in a land terminating scenario.
Implications for ecology, biogeochemistry. Any take on that? What is the big difference?
I think this is why Fjord has had such a lot of attention recently, and a lot of people do work on fjords with marine terminating glaciers, because there has been this research relatively recently that's shown that it really stimulates productivity. This subglacial discharge that entrains deep water is also bringing up all this nutritious water. It makes a huge difference to life in the fjords. Yeah, it's pretty cool because we see this also with the same data set. We haven't published the data yet, but we did a lot of ecological work, and we really see the difference in communities from phytoplankton level to larger zooplankton.
In the future, just thinking about all the glaciers are retreating, so you don't have these subglacial discharge upwelling, bringing up the nutrients anymore. What will change in the fjord ecology system, in the phytoplankton, zooplankton food web?
Do you mean during the transition or following a transition?
Following the transition, or whatever you prefer to answer.
Well, it's a difficult question, and there's lots of speculation. Some people say we'll actually see increased productivity in the meanwhile because of increased freshwater discharge. But I think following a transition, I think there's no doubt that we'll get more stratified fjords. This study has shown that it's not land-terminating glacier fjords are not undynamic, but there's going to be more stratification. I don't think that's much to deny. But it doesn't mean that there's going to be no life or something like that. So I think we'll see slight shifts in ecosystems. And one thing that a lot of people are predicting is smaller phytoplankton cells that are better adapted to less nutritious conditions.
Because when you increase stratification and you take away the mixing that happens by upwelling the subglacial discharge, you basically reduce the nutrient availability in the surface layers where they grow, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what's anticipated, that there'll be fewer nutrients available in surface water.
Too bad for the phytoplanktons, I guess.
Oh, or maybe good for the smaller phytoplankton and the bacteria. It's difficult to say. Some other takeaway is also trying not to emphasize the importance of the marine terminating glaciers. So while we do see some really significant effects that make a big difference in the fjord, there are other mixing mechanisms at play that we can also try to understand and use to try to understand the future states of these fjords when glaciers do retreat onto land.
If you have all the instruments and all the time, what would be your next step to investigate this topic?
Well, I mean, you've touched on the ecology, and that's where I'm taking my own PhD project now. Is what are the impacts on the food web structure of the differences in hydrography? But I would of course have loved to have current measurements, so using an ADCP profiler and be a little bit more concrete in actually the net flows and where they're taking place as well. That would be lovely.